Hi, Jim.
Hello.
Thanks for agreeing to do this. I really appreciate it. Would you just say your name and your role here at ASU?
Sure. My name is James Celmer. I'm a senior project manager for the University Technology Office. And I've been working here for 5 years and work on mostly information technology projects for our security team and networking team. And yeah, but it's my pleasure to be here today.
Well, thank you so much. So we were going to talk a little bit about project scheduling, and you were going to share some of your experiences on some projects and some of your expertise, some of your tips, some of your strategies, some of your philosophies about that.
Okay. Well, scheduling is interesting. This is where it helps to have a crystal ball, right? So what you're trying to do is you're trying to put together a timeline of events and try to kind of guesstimate when it's all going to end, when it's going to come to conclusion. So there's some preparation work that's required up front before you even start a schedule. Like even before you start breaking down tasks, work breakdown structure type of activity, you have to understand is what type of a project is this? Is there a hard deadline here? Or is this one that doesn't have a hard deadline? So for example, one of the hard deadlines that many of us that work at ASU have is start of semester, especially the start of fall semester. And in IT, it's certainly true. You don't want to be implementing anything. Well, for example, in information technology, we have what we call blackout periods. And what those mean is no changes to the infrastructure during like the first couple of weeks of fall semester, first couple of weeks of spring semesters, for example. We don't want to disrupt the environment because those are critical times for the startup of school. We just want things to go smoothly. Things like, for example, in the network area, our capacity is at the all-time high in the first, whatever, the second couple of weeks of August. I mean, we're kind of testing, full throughput. I mean, all the students are coming in and they're getting into classes for the first time. I mean, we are at full capacity, and we want to make sure that that the experience is good. So you have to be aware of these blackout type projects. So I mean, time frames with your project. If you're in a project like that needs to be done in time for fall semester, then that is a date that is very, very critical to the project.
And that could be, I'm sorry for interrupting, but so like in another industry, say that deals with some sort of like the fiscal year is, or the calendar year is there, and their blackout periods might be different time frames, different time periods, depending on what kind of organization or what kind of industry one is
Well, I
working
can give you
in.
another example. So in a past life, I worked for the Arizona State Department of Revenue. Think about that, right?
Right.
So tax processing.
Sure.
So one thing that happens every year without fault is that the tax laws change in the state of Arizona. Those happen, the legislature are the ones that make those decisions for us, and then they pass those changes along to the Department of Revenue to make sure that all the forms and the e-filing is now compliant with the new tax laws. Those are very, very, very strict timelines. So people that work in that environment understand that those dates have to be met. And so if project management is very key there, and people that work in that environment understand that as you're hitting the end of the calendar year, that this form has to be changed so that it's ready for the following tax year. I mean, things have to be ready to go. There's just no exception because you're dealing with millions and millions of people that file taxes in the state of Arizona. So sometimes, again, like start of semester is more of an ASU imposed deadline where just because of our quote-unquote business model of higher education, we need to make sure that we're ready on that date. Sometimes you're in a business structure where it's more like law or regulation or external requirements that says you got to have this done by this time. So those are things, again, that you need to know with scheduling. Do I have a hard and fast date? And I need to, because this will come into play with execute, or the monitor execute type of portion of schedule management. Is you have to understand is, what am I going to be able to work with if things don't go the way I predicted they would go? Do I have a little bit of leeway with the due date, or is it going to have to be on the deliverables,
Right.
or is it going to have to be on the quality, right? Kind of
Right.
the three-point constraint.
Yep.
So that's what's important to know up front, very early in the process, is you have to know what the context of this particular effort is. So once you have that figured out, then you can go into your crystal ball mold, which is kind of fun in a way. And there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. Some things are a little bit more like tried and true. We talked about building a house earlier. A lot of houses have been built. And there's a lot of companies out there that make a lot of money putting together software to help estimate that kind of stuff. So if you have access to those types of estimating tools, definitely would encourage to have those if that's the type of business you're in. So you can just, it'll give you all the different tasks that are required in building a house, working with your different subcontractors, and you would just plug in the various items, and it's going to give you a good work estimate and cost estimate and help you put everything together. Some things are a little bit more vague. It might be things that aren't very common out there, like putting together a network visibility and data aggregation system.
Right.
And
frequently projects exist in the most part because whatever is needed to be done hasn't been done before, at
Right.
least in that organization. That's why the organization needs to do it as a project.
Right.
Because it's kind of a one-off.
Right.
And because it has all these unknowns.
Yeah.
So by the very definition, the project is there because there's all these unknowns.
Yeah. So really where scheduling starts with is task identification, a work breakdown structure. So you want to go through everything that's required in the project. And this could be things that are even outside, of course, execution, right? The planning phase, initiation phase. Do we need to get approval to do this effort? One of the things, for folks that become career project managers, that they'll realize is that there's a lot of projects that an organization will want to do in a given time frame, like within a fiscal year. And so there's a huge portfolio of requests. And there's only a limited budget within that year to do those requests. So at the beginning, the way the project governance process happens is at certain periods of the year, usually a few months prior to the fiscal year, end and beginning, is all of the stakeholders of the university, the folks that are the decision makers and responsible for the various budgets, this is in the public sector, will say, I want to do this next year, and they will submit their idea. And of course for them, it's the most important thing, but then there's the other 30 people out there that also submit their idea, and they say it's the most important thing as well. And so there's a governance and justification process that says, well, we need to prioritize these, we only have a limited budget. Can we do all 30? How much are these each going to cost? Or can we only do 5 of them, because some of these are very expensive, but they're very critical to the future of the business goals of the organization. So those are things that need to be understood as well with scheduling, is making sure that that the project's vetted out and that it's approved, and that there'll be funding available with your best guess early estimate. So in those processes, you take a what they call a rough order of magnitude guess. Is I think it's going to be about this much, and those usually have I think they say a 50% margin of error.
Right.
But you have to give people some idea of what's the work effort and what's the funding is going to require to do it, so that they can do their portfolio governance. So once you get approved, and sometimes those are tasks that need to be identified in the very beginning. And once you get the green light to go ahead, And you got to make sure, again, that you're aware of what those cycles are as well. So that you kind of say, okay, well, here's where my start date's probably going to be. Here's when I can start engaging the team. Here's when funding would be available. So it doesn't really benefit us for us to do it now because the funding isn't there for this cycle. We need to go. We're going to have to start it, 3 months from now. So that's where those are some of the kind of events that happen within the project life cycle that will help you determine your start date of scheduling. When do we start getting people engaged? While you're kind of working towards the start date, there's a lot of preparation you can do. If you think it's pretty probable that the project's going to move forward, then you can start putting in the rigor to say, okay, what are we going to need to do within the phases of the project? How do we get this initiated? Scope, design, architecture, being able to identify what resources are needed in those, those initial phases.
And who are you relying on? Are you doing this all by yourself?
Well, it depends on the project.
Okay.
Right? Again, if you're a project manager that builds houses and you've built a lot of houses before, there's probably a lot of this, and you have a nice software tool, you can do a lot of it yourself. It really just depends. If it's something that is fairly new to you, then you have to rely on other people. There's different players that you're going to have to identify and tasks that you're going to have to identify based upon those types of criteria, right? So there might be a little bit more effort that's required in initiation and planning and kind of sharpening the saw before you get to execution if it's something that's new to the team. So you'll have to, again, we were talking about this when we were talking about cost and procurement. You may have to do an evaluation in the beginning and you'll want to schedule that out. So you'll say, well, before we can actually get to implementing or executing and actually putting this product into production, like way before that, we need to build in time for evaluation. And oh, by the way, this happens to be something that needs to be done by start of fall semester. It's probably going to take this long to execute, and we need to build in this much time. We can't start until this time. We need to build this much time in for evaluation. So you start at a higher level. What are the higher level things that need to be done within the project? Okay, I need evaluation, I need maybe a little bit of architecture, scoping and design, figure out what it is we're going to do. Then I have to take this and evaluate it with maybe 3 vendors. Then we have to come back and we need to start, we pick our vendor, we know how we're ready to kind of get started with implementation phase. Now we need to start planning the task for execution. And so in there is where you can rely on several things. Now you're trying to estimate how long it's going to take. Start out at the task level. Here's all the different tasks that are going to be required to get to the end point. Once you identified all your tasks, then you want to try to identify what type of resources. I usually like to start with the role, not the person. So these are the roles that we feel are going to be needed for these tasks. And then from there, you should be able to get kind of like an hourly rate to help with cost estimation. And then from there you can try to identify who's the actual individual that will actually be fulfilling that role. And then from there it becomes a little easier to do your estimation, because you can go to that person and say, well, I need you to do this task, how long do you think it'll take? And it's really a simple process there. You just say, okay, I think it'll take 8 hours. You say, okay, 8 hours, boom, go to the next one. Then you ask the other person that's responsible for that task, what do you think it'll take? And you can utilize that. And then once you have all of the tasks defined, you have the roles defined, you have people, and you have estimates for each of those things, then you can start to put it all together. And there's methods like critical path and things like that. So what types of things are sequential, what can be done at the same time, in parallel? Are there dependencies and things like that? And you start to build, that's how you start to build out your schedule. So you kind of build out what you see in project plan. And I always tell people, the project plan isn't the schedule. The schedule is your Gantt chart. The plan is actually a document that has all of your different aspects of project management in it. And it's a very handy tool. Definitely encourage people to utilize that. And it's always a good one to have in your back pocket if a stakeholder comes to you and has certain questions. Why are we doing it this way? Or what are we doing this? Or what about that? And you can say, well, in the project management plan, this is what we discussed, and things like that. So getting back to the schedule, once you've identified those tasks, then you start identifying dependencies, what can be done, what's your critical path and whatnot. And now you have kind of a beginning to end. Okay, here's all the things we think we're going to need to do. Here's who's going to do them, and what their dependencies are. Here's when we think, and now you kind of get you have your effort estimates for each of the tasks, and now you can formulate a duration. Okay, it's going to start here, it's going to end here, and now you can look at, okay, is this one of those projects that has a hard deadline? Are we going to be able to hit that deadline based upon our estimation? I can guarantee you that rarely does a project end on the day and the minute that you predicted it to do. So it's gonna, you're usually gonna be done a little earlier, a little bit past that day, but usually not on the day of. So you have to build in some contingency for that. Like if your schedule is coming in and says that you're gonna finish like on the day, that's not good. You don't want to be happy about that because things can go wrong, and this is risk management. You want to build in some contingency there. So when you're doing your initial duration estimates, you actually want that to come in a little earlier than your hard date, so that if there are things that happen, and life happens, it always does. I mean, I'll give you some examples of things that are pretty common that happen in projects. In information technology right now, the market's very hot, especially in the area of information security. And so you have a lot of turnover. And so you might start out with somebody on your project and then they get an offer somewhere else, and they leave, and now your resource that you started out with isn't there, and you're expecting something to happen. Well, what do? So you're going to have to make some adjustments there, and and if there's dependencies down the road, those things need to be addressed. They definitely want to be communicated to the people responsible right away, and decisions need to be made. How are you going to mitigate that information? So I'm starting to kind of get into execution of the schedule now, but those are the types of things that you need to look at. So build in some contingency into your overall schedule. Make sure that you have room there for things that may happen that might impact your ability to make a hard date, let's say, for example. There's some scientific methods, quote unquote scientific methods, that you can apply to determine contingency. And one of those is risk management. You could sit down with your team very early in the project and say, what are all the things that could possibly go wrong? Let's look at each of the major deliverables that we have. What are things that can go wrong? The example I just mentioned, that should certainly, especially if you have experience, you've worked in the area of, for example, cybersecurity for years, and you understand kind of the turnover rates, and you've seen it happen, you should definitely be putting that down in writing in your project, that if this person leaves, this will happen. And then even start thinking early on, this is how we would mitigate that, and here's what the impact might be. And then you can start to maybe factor that into your contingency. So those are some scientific ways to help, kind of more appropriate your overall duration of your schedule. Once you've done all of your crystal ball estimating, you actually get into executing the project. Then the idea is you have your project schedule, your Gantt chart or whatnot, as a guideline to keep things on track. And you say, okay, we said that we would start here and then we would finish there, and this is where the monitoring and controlling that PMG talks about it kind of comes in. You have to just stay on top of things. Human nature is human nature, and it's your job as a project manager to make sure that folks aren't getting distracted, they're not getting pulled away, and it's important to be a good people person and build relationships and get to know people and be friendly with them so that they're honest and upfront with you. And again, I think that's another quality of project management as well, is be straightforward with people. If something's not going right or something's not happening, have those discussions with the individual. Make sure the leadership knows about it. Approach it in the right way. Don't be pointing fingers or blame, but say, hey, listen, you know what? Right now this person is having some health issues or whatever. It's going to affect our overall ability to finish the project. I just want to make you aware of it, and we need to mitigate. Those types of things. Those are those are things that you need to address. And so those are the types of things you manage when you're actually going through schedule management. So another one I talked about earlier is lead time. Some things are out beyond your control. You may go through procurement, put in an order. They say the parts are going to get there on X, Y, or Z date, and they don't show up. And they say, well, you know, that part isn't available. We had this emergency thing happen with the federal government, and you know, Department of Defense is our, you know, our priority, and everything went to them. And you know, we don't have any inventory on hand. We got to wait for it to come off the manufacturing line, you know, and you're like, what, you know? And so, and I speak from experience. That's happened to me. Those exact words have been spoken to me. So you'll have to deal with that. And how do you? So what happens in those situations? Well, in this was actually my network access control project. This was one where we had to get network access control up and running so the Wi-Fi was available when semester started in August. So I went back to the team and I said, guys, here's the situation. These parts are going to be 30 days late. We wanted to get started on this date, and we just kind of had like kind of like a very like, you know, kind of honest upfront meeting saying it's not going to be a fun summer for us because we're probably not going to get the parts until July, like 4th weekend. We're going to have to, I said, based upon my estimation right now, like these parts are coming in the beginning of July. We're going to have to work through July 4th weekend to implement, and then we're going to have to work through all of July to make sure this is ready for August. Instead of being able to start 30 days earlier and to more leisurely work through and give yourself, you know, be able to do this 9 to 5, we basically had to what we call crash the schedule and said, we're going to have to work around the clock to get this done by August, and we did. And we had a nice little party afterwards, and everybody kind of gave each other high fives and slapped each other on the back. But those 30 days were critical, and we had to make those types of adjustments. And one thing to gauge when you're in a room like that is there anybody in there that's really not on board? Because everyone's going to have to be on board, and they have to be willing to do this, because that could be a risk to the project as well. Someone says, well, you know, I have a wedding planned, or right. Something like that, I'm not going to be able to do it. So you got to make sure, again, there's flexibility, there's communication, you have to be able to have contingency on your schedule management and things like that. So now, if you don't have a hard deadline, then there's maybe other things you can do. You can go back to the stakeholders and you can say, hey, part's not going to be available for another month. We're probably not going to be able to implement this until 30 days after the expected date. Do you approve that? And then sometimes they'll say yeah, and you're just like okay, and then you just push it forward. So what slips is your delivery date. Now, the thing to be cognizant of that though is there's impact outside of your project. So, so for the project itself, internally, you're like, okay, that's great. We'll just push it out 30 days. But now externally, your project manager, colleague that sits 3 desks down, comes over, knocks on your door, and says, "So you're going to keep my resource for 30 extra days? We were supposed to start the week after you guys are done, and now you're going to be pushing my project back." So every action or change has a consequence. And again, communication and flexibility and negotiation, those are all skills that project managers have to have. And realize that just because something changes within your project doesn't mean that it's only your project that's impacted. It might be that someone else is expecting to utilize a resource or a person as well, and you're going to need to work with them.
Right, or you might be slated as the project manager. You might be slated to move onto another project, right? And so how are you going to negotiate that?
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes what happens is, we were talking about when schedules go well and you stay, you have a nice contingency in there and everything goes well, and not a lot of things come up. Those are nice projects and things kind of just go smoothly. A lot of times little things happen and there are small adjustments you have to make. Sometimes you have a big adjustment like the one I mentioned. Sometimes the onus is on you as the project manager where you're going to have a tough month because let's say you do the delay of the schedule, maybe the guys on your team or the people on your team are not the ones that are impacted, but it's you now that is going to be going into execution and implementation of one project and then having to start up another one, and now you're going to have double work at that time, and your life's going to be a little bit crazy for 30 days as well. So it's in your own best interest to try to put some rigor into defining your schedule, staying in front of it, and understanding all the factors involved, doing appropriate risk management, resource management, and communicating with all members of your team, both, kind of up the chain and across the team, and even outside the team. It's important to be aware of other projects that are going on and, other resource demands. Resource management is just of most fundamental importance when it comes to schedule management, because you just people's availability is probably the most common thing that's going to affect your schedule. So.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Hopefully I covered all the topics you wanted me to.
You did.